What I thought I would do today is to take us through a couple of the major decision points of, of World War II. And by decision points, you can probably see what I'm not saying. The notion that wars have turning points, and I know that's in the title, and we're never going to get away from the phrase turning point. But the notion that wars have turning points seems to me to be one of the kind of cliches of military history, maybe the greatest cliche of all. And frankly, I'm kind of dubious about it, about the notion of a turning point. I'll try to explain why. Feel free to disagree. World War II, let us say, for example, was a huge conflict. It involved dozens of powers across the globe and hundreds of millions of human beings, either in uniform or in factories or simply upholding morale on the home front, dyed-in-the-wool civilians. But in one way or another, it touched the lives of 1 billion people. We call it a global war for a reason. It's stretched from pole to pole. We might say from east to west. Of course, the globe is there's a sphere; it's a globe, so you can't really say that. But there's hardly any corner of planet Earth that did not remain untouched. You can name it. The North Pole was action all over the place in the Arctic Circle. The Aleutian Islands, action all over the place. You hardly hear about it because no one's ever going to make a movie called North Pacific. It lacks all the glamour of the musical South Pacific. Australia, all over the place. Malaysia was a hotbed of activity in World War II. Africa, the European colonies in Africa often had to form their industrial bases, their production patterns, in order to serve the war economies of the metropoles. That is, the countries that dominated or owned them. So, the point is, it's really, really hard to find a spot on planet Earth that was somehow untouched by World War II. It was as big as it got. So the notion that one discrete event could literally turn World War II, literally transform defeat into victory. It's highly problematic to me, and again, I'm kind of dubious about it, and I would urge you to be a bit skeptical when people start drawing turning points of World War II. It probably required a war that big, requires multiple turning points, dozens, which nudge the war across the spectrum from victory to defeat for one side or the other. And in World War II is big enough. You're probably talking about maybe 30 or 40 events now that I would really stop to think about it. I guess our love for turning points comes from our fanaticism about athletics, as if war is some kind of football game. I grew up in the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. We had a president at the time, President Nixon, who constantly compared what was happening in Vietnam to a football game. He'd say we had a good defense, we had the momentum, we ran a blitz. There was Operation Linebacker, a bombing campaign over North Vietnam. So war isn't a football game. It's too complicated than that. There is no pick six before halftime that suddenly alters the momentum and sets the underdog, on the path to the W, the win. And in fact, sometimes at the end, weighing up whether you won or lost you have to be pretty careful about it. And that's rarely the case in any kind of athletic contest. So let's just be a little bit dubious about that. But having said that, so I write books, and I would say, war turning points, hard thing to really get. Come on, you got to be careful. And I wrote a book on the German army in 1942, centers on the Stalingrad campaign. And I bent over backwards not to use the phrase turning point. And the book came out, and I was lucky enough, it was in the History Book Club. It was a selection of the month. And I get the little brochure out of the History Book Club, and there it is. Rob Citino, turning point of World War II. It was right there in the ad. If it helps sell the book, what can I say? It was a contribution to my daughter's scholarship fund at the time. But it's one of those phrases you're never going to get rid of. So we need to use it, but let us just use it carefully. All that by way of saying. Now, having made that point, there were two moments in World War II, both early on in the conflict, in 1941, to be precise, that I would say radically changed the nature of the war. Not necessarily victory to defeat or defeat to victory for either side, but radically changed the nature of the war. The first was the decision by Adolf Hitler, the Führer, the leader of Nazi Germany, to launch an invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, June 22nd to be precise. You're looking at one of the most famous propaganda photos of all time, taken by Dr. Goebbels, the great German propaganda chief, and he knew how to He knew how to get these things posed. He has some great war photographers. Always remember, there's some photographer in front of that grenadier, the guy throwing the potato masher grenade there. But it's a good look at German soldiers just about crossing the border in June of 1941. Now, the other, oh, let me see here. The other was the decision by the Japanese Empire just about 6 months later, a little less than 6 months later, to go to war with the United States by attacking the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. And there is the unlucky destroyer, the USS Shaw. A Japanese bomb has just hit its forward ammunition magazine, either a great strike by the pilot or a lucky strike, probably a little bit of both. Good training and good luck kind of go hand in hand. And there is the USS Shaw going up like a torch with virtually all hands on deck. One of the iconic shots of the Pearl Harbor disaster on December 7th, 1941. Why were these decisions crucial? They took what had been two regional wars, one raging in Europe between Hitler's Germany and Britain and France, and then one raging in Asia, where the Japanese were trying to overrun China. Two regional wars. These decisions, first to bring the Soviet Union into the war, which sprawls across Europe and Asia, and then to bring the United States into the war, which is the power of the Western Hemisphere, turned two regional wars into a global war. So these to me are crucial decisions, crucial moments, once again, in 1941 that don't necessarily map out victory or defeat, but definitely change the nature of the war, create the global war, really begin World War II. They've been fighting virtually all over the globe, but now you can drop the virtually. So I'm not saying they're turning points. Let's call them decision points for a lack of a better phrase. Now, it's fair to ask, I think, what were they thinking? I mean, the Germans and the Japanese. Exactly what was on their mind? I mean, let's be honest about this. Each decision meant going to war with much larger, potentially much more powerful military forces. That's true for Germany, and it's true for Japan's decision as well. In 1941, for example, the USSR sprawled across 11 time zones. Today's Russia is nowhere near that big. It encompassed much of the Eurasian landmass. Europe proper is kind of an attachment to the old Soviet Union, a littoral, sort of the protrusion from a peninsula. The Soviet Union had a population at least 2 times that of Germany in 1941. So, you got to answer. There's the bar of history where you have to explain yourself, and someday Hitler's going to be there, and somebody's going to ask him to explain, well, what the heck were you thinking? And it's a good question because he's taking on a very, very big adversary. I don't think I have to belabor the point that going to war with Russia is inherently a kind of dangerous business. You can ask previous invaders, Charles XII of Sweden. You can ask Napoleon about whether it's a good idea. The United States, and Japan has now picked a fight with the US. The United States had an economy that was somewhere around 10% the size, excuse me, 10 times the size of Japan's, not 10%. The American economy was many, many, many times over larger than Japan's. And in just about every important index of modern military power, steel, oil, rubber, chemicals, you can go on and look, choose your index, and the United States vastly dominates Japan in it. And, I think you all out there know that, spoiler alert here, as we historians like to say, that neither decision worked out very well. The German campaign in the Soviet Union eventually turned into catastrophe. And I think we all know how the Japanese war against the United States ended into mushroom clouds in August of 1945 and a surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. So come back to that question again. What were they thinking when they made these decisions? Now, here's what's interesting to me as a historian. I guess we sit around and we compare this to that. We compare this event from 1941 to that event in 1066. And it's what we do. Comparative analysis is kind of the heart of being a historian. When I do comparative analysis to the Germans and Japanese in 1941, their thoughts, surprisingly, are moving in roughly parallel directions. So let's start, try to do this in some kind of coherent order. And start with the Germans and their Barbarossa decision, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then work our way over to the Japanese. So let's look at Germany first. Under a fanatical dictator who had been in power since 1933, and there he is, he's, for better or for worse, one of the most famous faces of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party. Germany had launched a war in September of 1939, invading Poland. Britain and France, in turn, 2 days later, declared war on Germany, and that ignited World War II in Europe, at least. We're talking September 1939, the invasion of Poland is the first, and then 2 days later, September 3rd, the declarations of war by Britain and France on Germany. You know, there's a story, and we used to believe it. It was told in every history book you could possibly find. But of late, people question whether it's true because it's been tough to find the original account. And if you can't find the original account of something, it's possible that somebody maybe made it up. But when Britain and France declared war on Germany, Adolf Hitler turned to his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and supposedly asked him, "What now? Was nun? What now?" Like as if he hadn't been expecting it. And what do we do now? Hitler had sort of bullied the Western powers into concession after concession in the 1930s. It finally stood up to him and declared war, and he seemed to be the most surprised person in the room. But you know, since that moment of surprise, in the first 2 years of the war in Europe, things went pretty much Germany's own way. Poland was conquered in a month, really less than that, but the capital held out for a couple more weeks, so roughly a month. There was a campaign in the far east, in the far north, that brought Denmark and Norway under control in April of 1940. And that was important in securing Germany's supplies of iron ore, which were carried, mined in neutral Sweden, carried to the Norwegian coast, and shipped down to Germany. The next month, in May of 1940, a gigantic invasion of Western Europe, that is of France and the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, we should never forget Luxembourg, gave the German army one of the most decisive victories of World War II, and I would say one of the most decisive victories of all time. The Germans smashed the French army in a matter of weeks, and the British forces that had come to France to fight a coalition war with the French, known as the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, it managed to escape Europe only by the skin of its teeth from the port of Dunkirk, the last port still in British hands. It's been the subject of numerous movies, including one quite recently, the sort of heroic last stand of the BEF at Dunkirk. I think most betting individuals would have said the British are done, but they managed to hold off the Germans just long enough, get enough shipping to the coast, and rescue their army again, as I would say, by the skin of its teeth. So let's look. I mean, let's just let this is all of Europe, and it's a little later in 1941. But let's look at Germany in the middle, and then points west. So there's Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. There's France, which is now controlled. There's Denmark and Norway. And you look then, of course, 20 miles across the English Channel. You're looking at the famous White Cliffs of Dover, and that's Great Britain. There's footage, of Hitler standing on the coastline with his binoculars, looking across at what he was certain would be his next conquest, and thus the end of the war, the conquest of Great Britain. But it's precisely at this point that problems emerged. Hitler looks dominant in Europe at the time, and certainly there's nobody facing him, no real military opposition. But in the course of the 1930s, Hitler had led a breakneck rearmament program, and he had to prioritize, and he had prioritized air forces and land forces, because that's what most of the fighting would be. But you need a big navy to invade Great Britain. Now, Hitler, and he didn't have one, Hitler tried to bomb Great Britain into submission in August and September of 1940, the famous Battle of Britain, but RAF fighter aircraft, and there's a Spitfire, took such a huge toll on the attacking German planes that Hitler was forced to postpone further plans against Great Britain. So the point is, as Hitler saw it, by late 1940, he was trapped in a war that he had no idea how to win. He couldn't invade Britain because he didn't have a navy. Behind Britain lay the vast resources of the British Empire. The Commonwealth nations of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, those they're willing to serve. But there's also India. There's the hundreds of millions of people in India, productive capacities, raw materials everywhere. South Africa with its diamonds and gold. The British have a gigantic empire. behind them. And there's nothing Hitler can do about that. He can't touch it. And behind that empire, behind those forces, there was Britain's great friend across the Atlantic. Of course, I'm speaking of the United States. The U.S. was neutral, but under the presidency of FDR, had already begun to supply Great Britain with military resources and materiel through the famous Lend-Lease program. Here's a good photo of American Lend-Lease equipment being opened, uncrated in a British port somewhere. Please notice those are Thompson submachine guns, also known as Tommy guns, the great gangster weapon of America in the 20s and 30s. I have a good quote on that as a caption. People said, people in politics said to Roosevelt, why don't you sell Britain these? Lending or leasing bases, whatever it might be. Lending, they're never going to pay it back. And Roosevelt said, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't go to him and say, I'll sell you the hose. You give him what he needs to put the fire out. Because what happens if your neighbor's house, that fire is unchecked and rages unchecked? What happens eventually? A spark flies onto your roof and ignites your house, and suddenly you're on fire too. So there's a good look at Lend-Lease in action, but also I think a choice quote from one of the most quotable. I know Professor Surrey will back me up on this. One of the most quotable presidents of all time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So over to Asia. Japan, too, was in tough straits by 1941. It had launched a war of conquest against neighboring China in 1937, 4 long years ago. It had overrun much of North China since then, and along with most of China's vast coastline. You can kind of see that from this map. Now, Japan never declared war on China, even though by 1941 it probably killed 1 million Chinese. This war was huge. Japan never declared war since it relied on imported raw materials for its military, especially from the US. A declaration of war would have led to complications with Washington. So I've always felt one of the great understatements of the 20th century. The Japanese, referred to their war in China as the China Incident. So it's an incident when you ravage your neighbor's country with fire and storm and steel and try to conquer the whole place and enslave the native population to your own industrial base, which is what the Japanese were doing. But for the record, it's the China Incident. Now, instead of a rapid victory Japan expected in 1937, China turned into a kind of, the famous word from Vietnam, a swamp, a quagmire, the Q word. The ruler of China, President Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China is the official name of the state at the time, resisted the invaders heroically. He wound up on the wrong side of history, folks, after World War II. He lost the Civil War to Mao Zedong and the communists. That's not to say he wasn't the crucial figure in Chinese resistance in the 1940s, and I think we sometimes forget about that, so I thought I'd put up a picture of him for you. The ruler of China, Chiang Kai-shek, resisted the Japanese invaders. He fled to the interior and he set up a new capital 1,000 miles inland at Chongqing. It had been Beijing in the north and then Nanjing in the south, and now Chongqing over to the west, and it means literally Western capital. Here too, just as with Britain, foreign supplies began to flow into China. Arms were arriving from the US and from Great Britain via a new road hacked out of the mountains from British Burma to China. And that road, of course, if you're passing from Burma to China, that road is built across the Himalaya mountains. And this is what it looks like for every inch of its hundreds of miles. It's one hairpin turn switchback after the other, a literal transmission nightmare. The remnants of burnt out transmissions and burnt out trucks. And if if the transmission burned out, you kind of push the truck over the side to let more traffic pass. So supplies are arriving in China to help China resist the Japanese. The Burma Road's a classic example. But more, China also had a cadre of Western volunteer pilots. Now, these are American pilots. They volunteered for service with the Republic of China to help contest the skies over China against the Japanese Air Force, which up till now had, completely dominated the skies in this fight over China. The Chinese really don't have much of a modern Air Force, but they have one now in the form of the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. This is a P-40 fighter plane, and you can see from the distinctive painting on the cowling in front of the the aircraft, you can see where it got its name. This is the example of a famous flying tiger. The flying tigers, the P-40 might not have been the best aircraft in the sky at the time. Japanese Zero, the famous fighter plane, could literally fly rings around it. But the P-40 was sturdy. It was reliable. It took a lot of bullets to bring it down. It was much more heavily armored than the Japanese as well. So at the very least, the Chinese are now beginning to contest the airspace over the battlefield. And that means everything in modern combat. If the opponent has control of the sky, you might as well just surrender. That's what I've always thought. The time has come to really reconsider your options because you're in trouble. And that had been the situation up until the arrival of the AVG, once again, American Volunteer Group, colloquially, the Flying Tigers. So the point of all of that, by mid-1941, the fighting in China had stalemated. The China incident was not coming to a quick and rapid conclusion as the Japanese wished. Large parts of China were in Japanese hands, and you saw that in the previous map. I don't know. I've seen statistics. A quarter to a third of mainland China was now in the hands of the Japanese. I would err on the high side. They're closer to a third. And so, if you know the population of China, and it's much of the coast where most of the population lives, hundreds of millions of Chinese were living under the horrors by now of Japanese occupation. But having said all that, even with 1.5 million Japanese troops tied down in China, Japan was no closer to ultimate victory. And this is starting to become a very unpopular war amongst the Japanese people, as I think, Japanese are just like us. They're just like everybody. All human beings are alike. Everyone likes war because it's exciting as long as it's quick and victorious. If it drags on for years and suddenly the possibilities of victory no longer seem so obvious, just about anybody is going to turn against a war eventually. And there's signs of dissent within Germany. Within Japan. Within Germany, you can see some of the same. The Germans obviously keep very careful watch on their population. The Gestapo, the secret state police, Geheime Staatspolizei. But even there, the Gestapo is reading signs of dissent amongst the German people too. I thought this war was going to be over, and here we are a couple of years later. So I guess we add all that up. In both cases, the Germans and Japanese felt that they were trapped in wars, that they saw no real a chance of winning, no real strategy for winning, at least if things stayed like they were. Germany had been stalemated unless it could figure out a way to hop across the English Channel without a navy. And good luck. The Japanese have been stalemated unless they could figure out how to conquer a country whose population was 6 times their own, or whatever the relationship between China and Japan was at times, probably even more than that. And, good luck with that one, too. Now, I said earlier, I love to take delight in the sort of similarities that sometimes pop up when we're doing comparative analysis. Here's the fascinating thing for me. In both cases, national leadership in Germany and Japan decided not to limit the war or to seek a negotiated peace, which is a sensible reaction to a war you're unable to win if you feel like you're unable to win. But in both cases, they decided to go for broke, to widen the war, to make it bigger. You can't win one war, so let's see if we can win a bigger one. It's counterintuitive. A word we all know from our computer activity. That program is not intuitive or it's counterintuitive. This is counterintuitive. But I want you to think about it for a moment. In both cases, the key seemed to be natural resources. And let me explain myself a bit. For Hitler, conquest of the USSR, with the oil fields of the Caucasus mountain region, some of the largest oil fields in the world at Baku, the huge deposits of iron ore and coal in the Donbass, the Don River Basin, the eastern portion of the Don River Bend. It's in Ukraine today. These resources would supply him with what he needed to finally defeat Great Britain once and for all. Maybe build that navy he needed to do. It would take years, but if he had the resources of the Soviet Union, virtually limitless, perhaps he could bring this war to a conclusion. He felt he had the army with its modern tanks and its aircraft to fight a quick lightning war in the USSR, to conquer the entire vast country in 6 weeks. After all, no one else could stand against the Germans. Why would the Soviets be able to? Their army would look primitive on paper. The training looked awful. The literacy standards of the typical soldier, abysmal. Now, to conquer the Soviet Union in 6 weeks, though, the war had to be swift and brutal and merciless, and the Germans had to strike down anybody who stood up to them. As you'll see from the document we're going to read a little later in our session tonight, the Commissar Order. So on June 22nd, 1941, the German army launched its planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. About 3 million troops involved in the original invasion, making it the largest land campaign in the history of mankind. Up till that time, you probably have to look at World War II and see if anything really eclipsed it, but it might still hold the world record. Caught the Soviets completely by surprise and destroyed much of the Soviet army along the border. Looked like it worked, by the way. I mean, in the first 3 or 4 months, I think the German high command was whatever the German equivalent of slapping high fives is, because everything they tried looked like it was working. They rounded up millions of prisoners in an army, a Soviet army that looked absolutely hapless. Now, back to Asia, if you don't mind. For the Japanese, resources were also the key to their problem. And their problem was how to find a way to victory in China. They could see a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity beckoning to them. In Europe, the Western powers had been, Western states of Europe had been overrun by the Germans, the Dutch. Britain was on its last legs. The French. They were tied down in their war with Hitler or conquered altogether. As a result, those colonial empires, the colonial empires belonging to those European states, were vulnerable. Think of the Pacific Basin as a very rich neighborhood. It's a gated community. But now the gatekeeper's gone. There are no more colonial powers. These colonies are ripe for the picking. A major portion of the global resource base. Rubber from French Indochina, tin from British Malaya, the vast oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, today would be Indonesia. It was a Dutch colony at the time. Royal Dutch Shell, one of the biggest oil companies at the time, existed because tiny Netherlands ruled 100 million Indonesians in the so-called Dutch East Indies. So here was the plan. If Japan could overrun these territories, seize the resources they contain, then establish a kind of fortified perimeter in the middle of the Pacific to protect their new conquest, it would have what it needed to end the war in China. So make it bigger. Don't make the war smaller. We got to make the war bigger. Now, there was only one thing standing in the way of that brilliant plan, and it was a country called the United States of America, which had interests in the Pacific, trading partners across the Pacific Ocean, which would never sit still and allow the entire western half of the Pacific Ocean, not to mention mainland Asia, to fall into Japanese hands. FDR had been signaling his displeasure with the Japanese for some time. In 1938, he had placed an embargo on arms sales to Japan. In 1940, extended it to scrap iron, which you say, well, who cares? Scrap iron is Japan doesn't have iron ore. It doesn't make its own steel. It melts down other nations' scrap iron into the steel that it needs. And we were a major, the United States, trying not to say we, trying to do too much home team talk here. The United States supplied most of that scrap iron. July 1941, the big one, we extended the embargo to oil, as well as published an order FDR did freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Now, I don't know where in your neighborhood, but in my neighborhood, that's this close to declaring war on somebody, saying we're freezing all your assets. Every single Japanese dollar in a U.S. bank was no longer, the American government had just kind of confiscated it. It's serious business. Japan doesn't produce a drop of its own oil. And so embargo on oil shipments to Japan is also a big hit. FDR knew it. FDR is not dumb when it comes to diplomatic affairs. He was sending the strongest possible message he could to the Japanese. Now, talks between the two powers went on all during the fall of 1941, but were fruitless. And Japanese frustration began to build as the oil tanks dry up, and they reached a boiling point in late November after receiving the sort of official U.S. position from Secretary of State Cordell Hull, which I won't go into the document now because we'll be reading it. It's one of the two documents we're going to be reading in just a few minutes. A few weeks later, on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, FDR said, the Japanese launched their bold strike on the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor and invaded all those Western colonies. And here's a good look of Japanese troops, victorious Japanese troops after one of their victories. And this is a land victory in China, actually. I just like the composition of the photo. And they have their arms, both arms raised, and they're shouting Banzai, which is 10,000 years. May the emperor live 10,000 years, the classic Japanese battle and victory cry. Let's finish up here. Just a couple of quick statements, and we'll get into and I think I'm doing pretty well on time, so it looks good. Besides natural resources, and I think that is what links the two decisions, by the way. I think it's the big link. It's the strategic link. Both Germany and Japan felt they lacked the natural resources to bring their wars to a successful conclusion, and so had to extend the wars, expand the wars in order to conquer those resources. But I think there are two other conceptual links between Barbarossa and Pearl Harbor worth thinking about. First, both decisions emerged from a sense of overconfidence. Well, that's one way of putting it. Both Germany and Japan, I'll put it a different way, saw themselves as racially superior to their adversaries. It's part of the ethos of the Japanese dictatorship that the Japanese are a divine race. They've been given the emperor, who is the direct lineal descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu from 800 AD down to the present day. He's believed to be divine. Likewise, in Hitler's twisted racial views, which are as twisted as you can possibly get, he views human beings as members of races of higher or lower worth. The peoples of Eastern Europe to Hitler, and thus the peoples of the Soviet Union, were subhumans, as the Nazis called them. Untermenschen in German. It's an ugly word and it's an ugly concept. They're human beings. There's not Superman and subhumans and people in the middle. We're all human beings. These subhumans would never be able to stand toe-to-toe with the superior German master race. And if he looked a little more closely, Hitler said, this was a communist country now, a Jewish plot, a fiendish Jewish plot that had taken over Russia and was now spreading across the globe. Presumably you all know that Hitler's primordial hatred is for the Jewish people. You know, back to the Japanese, we talked about the emperor. They had their own notions of racial superiority, especially over the Americans as well. The Japanese viewed the American people as kind of soft, pleasure-loving creatures who lacked the necessary warrior traits, who lacked the necessary guts to try to reconquer the Pacific island by island by island by island. They themselves, the Japanese believed, again, had an ancient warrior tradition dating back for centuries, you know, the ancient samurai. The tradition itself, the way of the warrior, the Japanese word bushido. So, you know, I don't have a lot of advice to Hitler and the Japanese militarists because they're gone. But if I did, I'd say, you know, never underestimate your enemy. I think that's probably if you're declaring war on somebody, don't get caught up in your own illusions. And in this case, I would say, don't get caught up in your own ideology. It's difficult. It's difficult to see your own blinders, right? Everybody else has them, but not me. I'm seeing things clearly. But in this case, the Japanese and the Germans both, you know, made some serious miscalculations based on their racism. There are honestly, you can find documents in the American doctrinal documents, that is, official Army and U.S. Army Air Forces publications, that say the Japanese, they're short, they lack the upper body strength, they have bad eyes, they have bad eyesight, they can never have the eagle eye that a white Western pilot would have. Now, Japanese had very cheap glasses. They had a sort of a primitive optical industry at the time. And so very often the glasses are much thicker. And you could look at that and say, well, that person must really be nearsighted, but it's just the kind of glasses he or she is wearing. So, you know, again, I hope I'm not having to convince everybody. Don't judge people based on their race, culture, ethnic background. Just remember you're fighting human beings. In this case, they're going to have something to say. They're not going to lie down for your global plans. One more point I'd like to make, and then I'll be done. In both these cases, that one more link, I think, between Barbarossa and Pearl. In both these cases, there's a common thread. Who was it who was blocking the dictatorships in Germany and Japan from realizing their dreams of world conquest? Now, okay, that's a question. You might say, well, let me think about that. Give you a hint. Who was it who was standing behind Great Britain, propping Great Britain up against Germany with Lend-Lease shipments? Who was it who was aiding China, keeping China afloat in its fight with Japan with Lend-Lease shipments and also even with live human pilots and P-40 aircraft? Finally, Which country was it that was destined to emerge from World War II as the most powerful and wealthy in the world? And frankly, still is. In all our problems, we like to emphasize our problems. Still by far the most powerful military juggernaut anywhere on planet Earth. Which country was that emerged from World War II as the most powerful in the world and still is? Which country was finally dragged into this war at Pearl Harbor? And I'll give you 3 guesses. So that's all I have for you right now. I think it's probably time for me to stop.